Hi, it's Paul here from Body Logic Health. Look, I'm just going to do a video today. I'm actually going to create two. We're going to look at our hip movements, so continuing on with that hip series that we're doing. We're going to look at hip hinge and we're going to look at hip extension. And really the idea is to try and understand why one might be more important to us to train than the other. But how training a movement pattern excessively can have an effect on our hip health and our movement patterns that relate to that. And that's what we see a lot in the clinic. A lot of people coming in and those hip patterns have changed over a long period of time, and we need to change the synergy of how those muscles are working together. So I think it's really important to try and understand how your hip moves so that you do the right training, right movement patterning for you as an individual, keep your hips healthy and make sure that they can look after you. Right, so what I'm going to look at now is hip extension. Now, hip extension, if we look at our last movement patterning stuff, and what I want to try and consider is what is the most important part for you to train. So we looked at hip hinge, so we've got a hip hinge movement pattern, which from here is hip extension. But we've driven into the movement pattern, and that's what I want to try and get people to look at. If this is the only way you move, because of the patterns of training, how you sit, the habits you adopt during the day, then that's going to create problems long term. So what we want to do is make sure that we have options and choices in how we move. So let's have a look. This is hip extension, but it's driven by your hip flexors and your back muscles remaining tight and strong and becoming over time overactive. What we want to look at is hip extension from flexion driving through. The difference, we're not already tight and engaged and overactive here. We're starting to get the glutes to work and work into a movement pattern where we're inhibiting our hip flexors, okay? We're starting to get our glutes to initiate the movement. Now, unfortunately in the modern world, we spend a lot of time sitting at computers, working at desks. Brilliant for those that don't, but for many of us that is part of the issue. We're spending 8, 10, maybe longer hours at a desk sitting. So we're in this flex that makes our glutes longer and more inefficient. And we need to counteract that so that that doesn't become our hip hinge movement pattern. We want to get hip extension, so we need to retrain differently to make sure that that hip extension pattern is working. Again, as I say, it's really important because if we're working our hip extension, we're working our abdominals to prevent back extension, our glutes and abdominals are working together, and we're driving off it, which gets a certain amount of inhibition of our hip flexors and our back muscles, which is where the imbalance can run. And we get those synergies right and we change them, and that can have a knock-on effect on how we're able to play sport, run, walk, our movement patterns change. And the key here is it's about having choice. And choice in movement means that we can choose to do this movement, but equally we can choose to do this movement, and we can drive off the single leg with hip extension without it being back extension. And so often I see clients when they're asked to do a movement pattern from here where they're working their glutes, and you can see my back is staying relatively still. We see too often people coming up and they're here and already stuck in hip flexion still. We want to get that drive. So when we're talking about hip extension versus hip hinge is a movement pattern. Hip extension is the movement we want to make sure we keep, because we don't in the modern world spend enough time going into that range effectively and getting the muscles around the hip to work together to create good movement patterns. What that then does, it takes some pressure off your hip joint, takes some pressure off your back joint, and actually will create much better gains for you whenever you're doing your training, walking and activities. So quick summary, we want to have a look at hip extension being a movement pattern that we drive into, and we'll have a look at some exercises over the next couple of weeks and really try and help understand. Key thing for you, can you do those movement patterns? Can you, from here, straighten up to standing without your back extending? On one leg, can you do that without this and being stuck in hip extension? So have a look at that. Have a think about what we've said, but really so important for your hip health to make sure that we get these things right and give your body the choice of moving in different ways.